Okay, so I hope that this camera picks up the noises, but you hear what sounds like people drumming and beating on things, and also people banging on pots and pans. That's called a cacerolacio. That is, ever since the days of the dictatorship, a very popular way of protest in Chile. So actually, all day today, people have been kind of hanging out of their windows of their apartments, beating on pots and pans as a way of showing, their lack of approval for what the government is doing. And the protests today have been insane. And they're still going on, and we are less than 20 minutes away from the curfew that the military declared. And it looks like a bunch of people are planning on breaking the law and staying out past 10 p.m. and continuing to defy the government, which is understandable considering that Chile has been through a dictatorship before, and the military dictatorship used things like toque de quedas or curfews as a way to control people. And this is the first time that the military has declared a toque de queda or a curfew since the dictatorship. And this is the first time that there have been military troops in Santiago since the dictatorship. And so to say that tensions are high right now in this country would be an understatement. So this is what's been going on all day. We're safe, don't worry. It's just intense. It's an intense time to be in Latin America right now. I don't know exactly how to start this video. I just know that I've been meaning to make this video for years. And I think what I'm witnessing here in Santiago, Chile is a great and pertinent opportunity for me. It's good timing for me to talk about this because this is an idea that or a perspective, I guess, that I've been feeling and trying to live by for a long time, especially since the 2016 elections in the United States, and now with the turmoil and protests and civil unrest and this kind of political and social revolution happening in Chile. So if you notice in the title, I titled this video "The Political is Sacred," and I've played around with the idea of the sacred is political, which is kind of an homage or a callback to that idea, that very second wave feminist idea of the personal is political. But I thought about switching those words, sacred and political. Instead of saying the sacred is political, I want to say that the political is sacred. Participation in politics is or can be sacred work. And when I'm talking about participation, I'm specifically thinking about protest, voting, things like protecting democracy, because democracy can be It's easy to lose. It's easy to lose. And throughout the world, we're seeing, in different countries throughout the world, we're seeing this kind of rise of a kind of new right-wing mentality. You have Bolsonaro in Brazil and Chile's current right-wing president, and you have the walking, talking anus that spews bullshit that is my president in the United States. In Europe, there are growing right-wing parties and Brexit and all this kind of stuff. So I often think about something that the American comedian George Carlin once said in one of his stand-ups. George Carlin was a classic, back in, I think mostly the 70s, the 80s, and into the 90s. And in one of his stand-up routines, he said, basically, I'm paraphrasing, it's important to remember that we don't have rights. We have temporary privileges. And so what he's saying is not that we literally don't have rights. I function under the assumption, like this is how my ethics work. I function under the assumption that there are certain inalienable rights, right? So, sure, if we think about our ethics, we might believe in inalienable rights, but that doesn't mean that governments are going to work to uphold those rights. And in a country like Chile, which has a history of dictatorship and torture, committed by and sanctioned by the state, I think the people of this country are particularly aware of the fact that those rights can be taken away. And that is one of the main driving forces behind this movement, this revolution that's been happening that's really exploded in the last week or so. So I wanted to make a video partially for me, just to help me kind of digest all of the emotional roller coaster that I've been going through witnessing this, to also talk about some of my experiences and the things that give me hope, but the things that also cause me great concern. And also I wanted to talk about politics as a realm of the sacred, especially in, this very globalized world that we live in, where everything and everyone is interconnected, right? So I'm going to have a bunch of links and resources down in the description box below, and I'll have them categorized so you can quickly go to the resource that you're most interested in. Among those resources, I'm going to include some videos I've already made in the past about, I think as part of my Witching Through Grad School series, I made a video about protest and protesting safely. And that was, in 2017, early 2017, during Trump's first few months in office, when there was a lot of chaos in the US, so that's why I made that video. I also recorded some of my protest activities that I participated in Boston, little clips of marches, like clips from the Women's March in Boston from 2017, the Muslim ban marches, there's Elizabeth Warren speaking, there's a clip too of the mayor of Boston at the time speaking about the Muslim ban and all of that. So I'll include those clips that I've made in previous videos below. But I also want to include resources, especially reliable resources in English, or maybe some video resources with subtitles in English, because I know the majority of my audience are English speakers and might not be able to speak or read or understand Spanish. So I'll have lots of resources down below. I also want to include some of the data so far that's been collected when it comes to police brutality, the number of people that have been detained. There's actually Amnesty International and the National Institute of Human Rights within Chile have kind of collected data on the number of reported sexual abuse cases that have happened, the number of reported the people who have been killed while protesting, that kind of stuff. So I'll include links to that. So basically, Friday, what date was Friday? I have to look at a calendar, it feels like so long ago. So things really ignited. Friday, October 18th, I believe was the date. And that is when we first heard the news in that evening about the subway stations being vandalized and in some cases set on fire. So and I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. I already talked about this in the last video where my partner and I were just checking in and letting everybody know that we're okay and we're safe, and we're still okay and we're still safe, but we can tell that, and this is something I'm going to get into later in the video, we can tell that there's some stress and like almost PTSD things going on at like a national level, and we're feeling it too. So other than that though, we're safe, we're okay, but tensions are still high, right? So last week the students, mostly high school and college students, organized a protest where they refused to pay to get on the metro, and this was a reaction to an increase in bus and metro fares in Santiago. But this was just the tip of the iceberg, as they say. The slogan of the movement, no es por 30 pesos, es por 30 años, means like it's not just for 30 peso increase, like a very small, what to maybe, I imagine a lot of Americans isn't that much money, 30 pesos. I mean, $1 is give or take around 700 Chilean pesos. So 30 pesos is nothing. However, if you take into account the extreme economic inequality in this country, it adds up. I remember when we were watching the news the other day, one of the Chilean senators, I can't remember his name, but he was saying that nearly 7 million Chileans live at or below the minimum wage in Chile. And Chile is only a country of around 18 million people. So nearly half of Chileans live at or below the minimum wage, I believe. Or at least that's the statistic that that government official gave. And so the Chilean minimum wage, I can't remember this off the top of my head, but I'll have it appear here in Chilean pesos and then in US dollars. But it's somewhere, I believe, off the top of my head, around $400 or $500 US a month, because they count their salary in terms of month, like your monthly salary. That's nothing. That's nothing. And especially in the last 10 years or so, there have been, throughout Santiago at least, just drastic increases in the cost of living, in rent, education. Still, there are a lot of people getting into debt, paying for their education. There are so many government systems that have been privatized, especially since around the year 2000 or so, going forward. You know, all of the water in Chile is owned by private companies. The highways are owned by private companies, and so when people pay a toll on the highway, and there's a lot of people who commute in and out of Santiago, and they have to pay that toll every day, multiple times a day, they're not paying the toll to the government to use those funds for you know, keeping up with the infrastructure. They're paying those tolls to private companies because a private company owns the highway. The rent is going up and up and up, and so a lot of people are struggling. The retirement system, it has also been heavily privatized, and you know, people are, you know, in their 60s and 70s wanting to retire, but they're barely making 130,000 Chilean pesos a month. That would be like, I don't know, around $200 US a month for their retirement, and they have to somehow make ends meet with that. Well, a lot of them end up working still. There's just so much wrong with the neoliberal, very neoliberal capitalist system that was enforced onto Chile right? Especially by the right wing and the wealthy class of Chile with the help of the United States, because keep in mind, between 1973 and 1990, Chile was under a military dictatorship, and that dictatorship was aided by the CIA and US-based economic interests in the US government, right? To try to enforce this neoliberal economic model onto Chile, even though at that time they had a democratically elected socialist president. It was a coup. It was just a violent coup. Thousands of people were tortured and disappeared by the government. There's still people who are looking for their family members' bodies. It was just horrendous. And so in 1990, there's a transition to democracy, but that transition continued the neoliberal economic model, and now Chileans in the past week or so have, at least a good portion of Chileans have decided that they've had enough of this model. They're sick and tired of all of this privatization. Because the model is working very well for a few at the expense of the many, right? And so Friday night is when all the protests kind of really heated up, and a lot of the destruction was happening overnight. By Saturday, or at least Saturday night, was the first toque de queda, which means curfew. Piñera had already, Piñera is the president of Chile. The government that weekend, it's hard for me to exactly remember when all these things happened, because it was just one thing after another. But that weekend was when the military was brought into Santiago, a state of emergency was called, but then also the protests started spreading throughout the country, from the north of the country all the way down to the very south, in cities like Concepción, Antofagasta, Valparaíso, Viña del Mar, Punta Arenas, Puerto Montt, like all of these cities, large and small, throughout Chile started having their own protest movements, and still have their own protest movements. And so that was the beginning of everything, really. And there was a point this past weekend around October, I think it was Sunday, October 20th, and Monday, October 21st, when the country felt like it was on the verge of entering another military dictatorship. Like this close. Because Piñera, as the president, spoke Sunday evening and started talking about being at war, started talking as if all of this destruction and protesting were acts of terrorism, basically. He didn't use the terrorism word, but he kind of described things that way, even though there was no evidence to show that this was like some sort of organized effort by one group or whatever. These protests obviously, to my eyes, spread organically through social media and tapped into the general Chilean people's frustrations and anger and pain caused by the neoliberal economic system that Piñera himself has profited from. I mean, he's a billionaire. I think he's worth around $2.7 billion, right? So another billionaire president. So those were really, really tense days. I believe we had 7 nights in a row of the military curfew. There are soldiers still in Santiago. There are soldiers still in other major Chilean cities. And there have been there have been human rights violations. There are cases where there have been people who were killed at the hands of the military and the police forces. There are claims that there have been sexual abuse and sexual assault within police custody. There are over 3,000 people who have been arrested. And the country is still very much in chaos. The metro lines over that first weekend were completely shut down in Santiago, and then they slowly started to try to reopen, but they're still not even halfway functioning. And in a city of 6 million people, I mean, just imagine a city like New York having its entire metro system shut down because of the protests and the destruction, right? The amount of damage has been catastrophic. There are a lot of supermarkets and stores that were looted by people taking advantage of the chaos. But there have also been, like I said, a lot of cases of people losing eyes because they were shot at with rubber bullets, people suffering from complications caused by the tear gas. There have been some people who were actually killed while in police custody and in military custody. It's haunting to see the soldiers in Santiago, keeping in mind the history of a military coup. It's been real, y'all. It's been real. Just today, I have the TV on right now. I have it on mute just to keep an eye on what's going on, because just today, President Piñera, the first news stories I saw yesterday was that he was planning on asking his whole cabinet to resign, but so far 8 cabinet members have stepped down and he's replaced them with new members. And one of those cabinet members was this guy, the original cabinet member. His last name was Chadwick. There are photographs of him as a young man back in the day with Pinochet, with the dictator. Like, he was part of the dictatorship, part of the structure and the government of the dictatorship. And he was the Minister of the Interior up until today. He was replaced by another guy. And so you have the memory of the dictatorship is just alive and well here. I mean, there are people who lived through it. There are people who suffered from it. And it's in the geography of the place. It's in the architecture of this city. For example, I'm in my apartment right now. Our apartment is just blocks away from the National Football Stadium or soccer stadium. And at first, when the military coup back in 1973 first started, they used that stadium as a prison and tortured and killed people there. So that's down the road that way. And if I go down the road this way, about 10-minute walk, there is a memorial because there used to be a torture center during the dictatorship just down the road that way. My mother-in-law, the original owner of her home, was a guy who was disappeared by the dictatorship. Tortured and killed and disappeared by the dictatorship. And that's the home that my partner grew up in, right? So older Chileans are having to relive a lot of this trauma, seeing the military in the streets, seeing the police brutality, right? Seeing the government act so quickly and irresponsibly to send the soldiers out into the street, right? The collective trauma is real. The collective trauma is real. And so to combat that trauma and to fight back, I've witnessed so many beautiful things too. And so I kind of want to move on to talking about the beautiful things I've witnessed. Just even here on my street, in our neighborhood in Santiago, it's hard to explain. For every night since that first Saturday, October 19th. There have been a group of protesters down the street from us who set up a barricade, they block traffic, and they're there just openly defying the government and openly defying the military curfews, because the whole point of the curfew means it's illegal to be outside of your home after a certain time at night. And the first few curfews were like 7 or 8 p.m. Eventually they did become later and later, like 10 or 11 p.m. But still, like the military is telling you when it's legal or not to be outside of your home. And it's a way to control the protests. It's a way to also impede on your right to be wherever you want to be. It's a way to keep people from meeting and organizing too, but at least thanks to the internet, people don't need to be in the same physical place. But anyway, so people were outside throughout, and this happened throughout Santiago. There were smaller protests on top of the larger protests, which were mainly in Plaza Ñuñoa, which is close to here, and Plaza Italia, which is a traditional kind of protest and meetup place in Santiago. Like there were smaller ones spread throughout the city, and every night at around curfew, there would be people out there banging pots and pans, right? Which is a traditional way of showing protest and solidarity during political movements in Chile. It's called cacerolazo. I'll have the word down here. So you take a cacerola, or like a pan, a fry pan, an old pot from the kitchen, and a wooden spoon, and you just bang it. And all of your neighbors join in, and everyone joins together, and it's just so fucking magical. Like, I know in some like old school folk kind of magic traditions, it's you can walk through your house with like a spoon and a pan and just bang on the pan, and the noise is meant to kind of clear the energy and get rid of negative spirits or whatever. Well, just imagine like thousands and thousands of people in all major cities of the country, in Santiago, in Concepcion in the south, in Antofagasta in the north, just out there banging. Just thousands of people banging their pots and pans together out in the street, openly defying curfew and standing up to the police and the military. It's just eye-opening for me. I guess as an American, and I know in the US we're so polarized and divided right now, I just can't imagine that kind of solidarity happening anytime soon. But I witnessed like such incredible solidarity. I witnessed so many Chilean people on the news and in person and like participating in the huge march last Friday, just saying, no, if we don't stand up and do something, we could slip into a dictatorship again. And that ain't happening. Never again. Nunca más. Nunca más. And so my small way of contributing, since I can't legally protest because I'm not a citizen, was to open up our kitchen window and bang my pot and pan with the neighbors, and the neighbors across the street, the neighbors in our building, the neighbors down the street, right? And we would especially bang our pots and pans to let the people protesting down the street know when we saw the riot police show up. Because every night, even after they lifted the curfews 2 nights ago, those people, those warriors down the street from us have been standing up to the powers that be, and every night the police show up and shoot tear gas into them. Every fucking night. And the tear gas comes into our kitchen window. And it's just, words are failing me right now to be able to describe this experience. Just imagine like banging your wooden spoon and your pot out your window in unison with people you don't even know, because you all agree at least on one thing, and that is nunca más, never again. We're not going to let this happen again. We're not going to let our government take more rights away from us. We're not going to let the military take over again. It's powerful. Like, that is the definition of magic to me. That was transpersonal for me. And also, a really transformative experience was witnessing what's been dubbed La Marcha Más Grande de la Historia de Chile, so the biggest march in Chile's history. And so last Friday, what would be October 25th, I believe, it was organized through social media, and there was a call for families and just people of all backgrounds to show up to march, starting at Plaza Italia and the center of Santiago, to say never again, never again, and to express themselves politically in a peaceful manner, to show the Piñera administration that more change is necessary, because the previous Monday, October, I believe it was 20th or 21st, Piñera made an announcement that he and his government had put together a package of different policies that were going to go into effect, or that they were going to try to push to kind of fix the problem. But the problem is all the policies upheld the neoliberal economic model. It was just a question of like moving around government subsidies to help kind of fix the holes. It was like putting duct tape over a hole on a boat, you know? You're still out there and the boat is still slowly sinking. The duct tape just kind of slows down the sinking of the boat, right? It wasn't a permanent fix. It wasn't a systemic change, which is what the Chilean people want, is a systemic change. They want a new constitution, because right now, Chile is still functioning under the constitution that was put in place by Pinochet, the dictator. They're still working with a dictatorship constitution, right? Goddamn. And they don't want to just move around government subsidies. They want to end the privatization of the roads and the water. They want to end the privatization of the healthcare and privatization of education. So many Chileans that I've seen interviewed on TV and that I saw holding signs at that mega march last Friday were saying, we're done with this neoliberal economic model. Like, we're done with capitalism out of control. Because capitalism out of control is what got us into this mess for the past 30 years since we transitioned from dictatorship to democracy. In that aspect, the dictatorship has continued, right? And it was just so beautiful to go out there and see. I mean, it was supposed to be a march, but so many people showed up that they couldn't march anywhere. Not everybody even fit in the planned space. Like, over 1.5 million people showed up at the center of Santiago to express their voice and try to stand up for democracy and protect their future and the future for their children and grandchildren, right? 1.5 million people out of a country of only 18 million. That's a significant portion of the population, right? And that doesn't even represent everybody who has participated in this march, because there's also thousands of people in other parts of the country, right, in the other cities that couldn't make it to Santiago that day. And there's even more people within Santiago that couldn't make it to the march that day but still support it. It was powerful to see that many people come together. So powerful. The political is sacred to me because to participate in politics is an exercise of personal power. But it can also become an exercise of the shadow side of power, which is domination, authoritarianism, and just repression, right? There's a shadow side to political power, of course, right? And we're seeing kind of a reemergence of that, a scary, oh my God, we got too close kind of thing happening, right? Around the world, not just in Chile and not just in the US. I was looking over the notes I took as I was reading Eastern Body, Western Mind back in August, And there's a section where the author talks about power, and she says that the true purpose of power is transformation, and that the will is power plus choice, right? The free choice to exercise your power. And she goes more into detail about how power is, it's not like subjugation or it's exercising power over someone. It's really more along the lines of self-determination and sovereignty. To me, it goes back to this idea of those inalienable rights, right? To the ethics of what does it mean to be a human being in this very globalized 21st century, right? And an integral part of that is recognizing the interconnection between people as citizens of states, right? People as immigrants, people as these beings that have inalienable rights, but also who are interconnected, who depend on each other, right? And so I wrote down here in my notes, protest and power equal magic. And protest is such a sacred act. Protest is just, it's a real shame. I feel like in the US, especially with the rise of the alt-right and more right-wing conservative, very Christian politicians, and the rise of Trump and all of that, they've really done a good job of weakening the power of protest, weakening the people's right to protest. And that's very dangerous whenever they make it harder for people to protest. And really being down here in Chile and witnessing like a different type of protest culture where the people are not afraid to get up in the face of the riot police and in the face of the military soldiers has been impressive. And it really kind of affirmed to me the importance of protest, the importance of political manifestaciones, right? Like the right of the people to get together and make their voices heard, force the government to listen to them, right? And so I would characterize what's happening in Chile right now and in other parts of Latin America as like a sacred revolution or a holy rebellion, because what the people are fighting for are those inalienable rights, right? The right to education, the right to health care, the right to not have to be afraid of how they're going to make ends meet when they retire after they've participated in this economic system and paid their taxes and participated in the free market. By the time they get to old age, when it's time to retire, how does the market treat them? It abandons them, right? It abandons them. And the same can be said for differently abled people and non-neurotypical people. How does the capitalist neoliberal market treat them? It treats them as if they're burdens to the system, as if they, as human beings, are less valuable because they cannot participate in the economic system the same way that an able-bodied or a neurotypical person can, right? And so what the people are tapping into is a fundamental problem with how the neoliberal capitalist system has worked so far, because it becomes a system, a hierarchical system, where certain people are more important, have more rights, and more power than others. It's a very top-down kind of system, and that is what the people are challenging, and they're fighting for their basic human dignity. One of the catchphrases of this movement here in Chile has been por una vida digna, for a dignified life. The people aren't asking for, millions of dollars to be just sent to their bank accounts overnight. They're just asking for a dignified life, because it's what they deserve as human beings. It's what we all deserve, right? And I really can't think of anything more important and pressing and sacred than fighting for that. So just to wrap this video up, and I guess I'm still very much processing all of my emotions and everything that I've witnessed, and just watching the Chilean people go through so much trauma and remembering what happened before and being afraid of that happening again, and being frustrated with the system that isn't working for most people, and like the Chilean people being brave and incredibly strong to question the power and authority of the people who assume that they have power and authority over them, right? The Chilean people are taking their power back. And it's so exhilarating, but it's also incredibly frightening and traumatic to see this process live as it's happening. And so this holy rebellion, this sacred revolution is really, I can't help but understand it and view it in terms of alchemy, in terms of that sacred work of liberating yourself, that liberation, that transcendence, it's the gall to try to transcend the current situation and move on to something better, something more beautiful and more equitable for everyone. That takes guts right there. I'm sure I'll continue to kind of talk about this in future videos. If you would like to see more content about this, let me know down below. I am still working on a couple of book reviews, but just be aware that they will be late, of course. I'm behind in my work, and I've gotten behind in my witchy studies, so to speak. So those videos aren't going to come up until November. But just please know that we're still safe and okay, but this situation, it's going to take this current revolution happening in Chile is going to have a ripple effect throughout Latin America. It already has, but also a ripple effect that reaches far into the future of Chile, the future of this country. And my hope and my prayer is that this brings about positive changes for the Chilean people, more equity, more social justice for the Chilean people. But it's just hard to tell right now because there's just still so much that is unknown, and so much more work to do. So if you have any specific comments about my experience of living in Chile during this time, please comment down below. And what are your thoughts about the politics being sacred? I know this is somewhat of a debate within the witchy pagan community. To me, it's no debate at all. It's a given fact that my political participation, fighting for my rights and the rights of others, fighting to create a more equitable world, is an integral part of my spirituality and my witchcraft. Absolutely, it's not a debate at all, but I understand for some other people it might be. So what are your thoughts on all of this? Comment down below, and thanks for watching.